My name is Josh Rubenstein, as you saw above, and today I'm going to be talking about the analog tape. Now, before we talk about the analog tape, I thought we would first talk about what analog is. And to get an idea of what analog is, I thought I'd compare and contrast it with digital, or more so contrast it with digital. So, analog is usually a mechanical system, and in the case of signals, it would be using continuously changing voltages at, infinite amounts of voltages that are always changing. An example of an analog signal down here, as you can see, the voltage is in a wave format, it's a wave, and waves have an infinite amount of numbers that go into them. So like if the top of the wave was 1 and the bottom of the wave is -1, there is an infinite amount of numbers between 1 to 0 to -1, and then back up to 0 to -1. So in terms of precision, analog allows you to be as precise as you want to be, because there is an infinite amount of choices for you to choose from. So you could be as precise as 0.00000001, and it would give you the number every single time. Now, digital is usually an electrical system, as in a computer, a motherboard, just a computer, basically. And in the case of a signal, it would use defined levels of voltages, like zeros and ones. The set number of voltages, usually limited due to fixed number, the whole shebang. So basically, digital, this is an example of digital signals, they can only give a finite number amount of signals. And all computers at their core have zeros and ones, switches that turn on and off, that make it 0 or 1. And the digital clock is no different. The digital clock is an example of what's it called? Of digital signals and just digital in general, hence the name digital clock. The digital clock is completely electronic and will give you a time, but the time is usually limited to minutes or seconds. The analog clock, on the other hand, is not limited in such a way. Analog clocks can tell minutes, seconds, milliseconds, and so on. It depends on how precise you want the analog clock to be, but since the analog clock is mechanical and uses analog signals to work, there will be as small as a measurement as you want. So if you stop an analog clock at a certain period of time, it'll give you that exact time. If you stop a digital clock at a certain time, it'll give you a second, maybe a millisecond. All right, so that was analog versus digital. Now we know what analog signals are. And now we can move on to the history of the analog tape. All right, so some history behind the analog tape. Like everything else, it all started with the phonautograph and the phonograph. These two pieces of technology were the starting point of being able to record and play back sound. These were the starting points. And then the gramophone, which were essentially early records, came along, and these were able to be mass-produced, and they could contain entire songs on one disc. And however, the gramophone had its problems. One being that it was too big and it didn't have enough space, and also some sound quality issues. This is where the magnetophone came in. This was invented by Fritz. I'm just gonna leave that last name alone. I don't want to butcher it. I'll just call him Fritz. So it was invented by Fritz in 1935. And he was actually inspired by the electromagnetic recording capabilities of the telegraphone. And he then decided to make his magnetophone. This is a picture of one of his first prototypes. He got it patented and everything. So at its core, his design for the magnetophone was essentially a supply spool that would supply the tape. They would run through multiple heads. There was the erase head, the record head, the playback head. Then there's the capstan, which is what pulls the tape out of the supply spool and into the take-up spool. Now, I'll get into what these heads do. So basically, the first head that the spool or the tape passes by is the erase head, and the erase head erases any magnetic imprint prior to recording and removes any unwanted sounds or feedback. The record head is essentially a head that is attached to a microphone, and the sound spoke into that microphone is converted into an electromagnetic signal, which is then recorded on the tape. This tape was made of some special materials that allowed it to record magnetic imprints, and a magnetic imprint would be implanted into the tape, and then the playback head, which is right next to the record head, would convert this magnetic imprint back into sound via a speaker. And that is how it would work. What they would do is they would run the tape through once, record their sound, and then they would rewind the tape and then play it again, take out the record head this time and put down the playback head, and they would listen to what they made, and it worked. And I already explained what the capstan is. It's to control the speed at which the tape is moving. It's that little thing right there. Basically moves the tape from the supply spool to the take-up spool. And yeah, that's basically how Fritz made his first magnetophone. Now, unfortunately, World War II began, and the magnetophone was slipping under the rug, or was slipped under the rug because World War II, he was in Germany, not best time in Germany, so a lot of things were slipped under the rug and kind of forgotten about. But it made a comeback after the war, especially in America, thanks to Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby was America's first multimedia star. He did everything in music, sound, movies. He was very big back then, back in the 40s and 50s. And he had the biggest radio personality in the 30s and the 40s. Did a lot of movies. He was just an all-around very talented and very good guy. After the war, he saw a demonstration of the tape recorder, the magnetophone from Germany, and he liked it, and he invested over $50,000 into a company called Ampex to mass produce these things. And he would then use these new magnetophones and other variants of the magnetophone, the tape recorders, and he would become the first performer to pre-record his radio shows. So basically, like days, weeks in advance, he'll sit down at his desk, turn on his analog tape recorder, record his show for the specific day. Once he was done, he would label them, and then when the day came, he would come into the office and play it on the radio. And he became very popular for it, and this is really what popularized the analog radio, or not the analog radio, the analog tape. Now I already talked about this, I talked about that. Now I'll talk about the moving from the magnetophone to the modern analog tapes. So it's about time that I start explaining some of the shortcomings. Early analog tapes had their weaknesses, one being low fidelity, which was at its core sound quality, and these older analog tapes also had a lot of distortion on them. This would need to be improved before recorded music industries could take off. Like, a lot of people wanted better quality sound. A lot of people haven't heard better quality sound, so they don't know what it sounds like, but still, it would be nice to have better quality sound. So in the 60s, multiple modern tape cassettes were introduced, such as the compact. One of the biggest examples was the compact cassette. This was invented by a Dutch company named Philips, and they invented this in 1962. And these models used both DC and AC bias to greatly raise the fidelity and decrease the distortion. I should probably explain what DC and AC bias is. So, tape bias. There were two types of tape bias that would be used to decrease the distortion and improve the quality of these tapes. So normally, without any bias, there would be a lot of distortion, and it would really mess with what you were trying to hear, make it hard to hear. There's a lot of static in the background and everything. So the first bias that was introduced was DC bias, and this and DC bias would basically add direct current to the audio signal that was being recorded. And this would limit distortion. It would make it easier to hear, but it left behind a lot of excess noise. Like it left behind this weird sound in the background. It was better than no bias at all, but it could still be a lot better. And that's when AC bias was involved. And AC bias is the primary bias that's used in all tapes today and beyond. So AC bias is the addition of inaudible high-frequency signals ranging from 40 to 150 kilohertz, which is ultrasound. It's the same frequencies that are used in ultrasounds to find babies or in the mom's womb. And these were used, these were added on to the audio signals, and this was great. This greatly limited the distortion, and it also got rid of the background noise, and it also improved fidelity. So it greatly improved how sound sounds on a tape. And I will be playing some videos of basically what reel-to-reel tapes without any bias sounded like, and reel-to-reel tapes with AC bias sounded like. So as you could hear in that first example, there was quite a bit of distortion, and it kind of messed with what you were hearing. It made it a lot more flat, and music instruments were harder to pick up, and it was kind of all around not as good as it is now. Now we will listen to a reel-to-reel tape with AC bias, and you will be able to listen to the improvements. So yeah, as you can see, the AC bias greatly improved the quality and also got rid of a lot of the distortion. So now you could hear a lot more distinct musical instruments and actually like hear what instruments were being played, what sounds were being played, all that. It all around made it sound a lot better. Now I will move on to impact on society. So I'll get back to the compact cassette now. The compact cassette, like I said, uses DC and AC bias to greatly improve the fidelity and decrease the distortion. They were also a lot more compact, allowing for people to easily listen to portable music and even record music of their own a lot easier. On top of that, they were also much cheaper, allowing more people to enjoy and make music. And these modern cassettes also had enough space to fit multiple songs on one tape, allowing for the creation of albums, which are essentially just songs, a bunch of songs in a group, usually made by the same artist in a certain album. But yeah, the people were able to create albums, and they were also able to create mixtapes. And mixtapes, as we know, were a huge thing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So these modern tape cassettes would go on to replace vinyl, vinyl records, as one of the primary ways to listen to music in the 70s and 80s. It became a huge thing. Everyone would have a little personal handheld cassette player. They'd carry it around, play it with their friends, record things. It was a good time. People had a lot of fun with it. Unfortunately, there was a decrease in popularity in the late 80s and early 90s. The market for the cassette tapes declined sharply in the early 90s and were quickly replaced by CDs because CDs were a lot more compact, easier to use. Just, they were replaced by something that was better. Cassette tapes did, however, make a small comeback in the 21st century. Early 2000s to now, basically. Many artists who work in the genre of metal, death metal, and rock, the song genres that were very popular in the 80s and 90s and whatnot. A lot of artists in these genres would use them because of tradition and nostalgia that was felt by both the artists and the fans. Tradition and nostalgia played a huge part in especially these genres and why artists of these genres still use them. And another reason why they're still quite popular is because there are also many other DJs, artists, and private companies who primarily use cassette tapes due to the fact that they're low cost, easy to use, and give similar results in quality to the alternatives of today, like CDs and whatnot. In fact, there are many companies out there. For example, RGI, a company in Germany, who bought the old formula for the tape, for the tapes, like from back when they first were made, and they sell it to analog tape enthusiasts all over the world. And people still use that tape formula, and they still use those tapes to record songs and albums and everything. So while the analog tape is less popular now, it's far from dead. It's still used widely around, usually for nostalgia and the fact that it's cheaper and easier to use. But still, it's still used. And now I would like to talk about my personal opinion on these analog tapes. My personal opinion, they are an excellent piece of technology, very, very innovative, especially for the time that they were in. It was very, very innovative for its time, and really laid the foundation for what future technologies would bring, like CDs and whatnot. Also played a huge part in music in like the 80s, 90s, 70s. You see cassette players and different types of cassette players and analog tapes and all of these things. You see them very commonly in a lot of like entertainment from back then, like movies, TV shows. Like for example, like Marvel, Guardians of the Galaxy, you have Star-Lord carrying his little personal cassette player, and that was because he was from the 80s. And yeah, it played a very big role in culture, especially during those times. Yeah. So yeah, that's my personal opinion on analog tapes, and yeah. And yeah, that's pretty much it. That was my presentation on analog tapes. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.